In fact, the success of the economic sanction is the result of the fact that Russia is now generating the pains only this of public debt. And with the no-allegiance countries, the Russia regime surprise subsists. Hello to all followers of the channel. I am Dr.Christian Barrientos Ichaso, international trade and business, compliance anti-corruption lawyer. And today, Sunday, May 22 of 2022, we start the podcast with Martin Arostegui on our international law channel. Thank you for subscribing to our YouTube channel and sharing everything about the international law, security, compliance, anti-corruption, anti-crime, and business. Martin Arostegui is a renowned and highly experienced journalist, especially in military and intelligence matters, who has covered of the kind of the international conflicts we are now seeing deploying in Ukraine. He has worked for Voice of America, Wall Street Journal, the Daily Telegraph, the Washington Times, CNN, Fox News, United Press International, and France 24. And he's author of a book about military special operation called Twilight Warriors. Thank you, Martin. Thank you. We start this podcast with you.
Thank you very much, Christian. Thanks for the introduction. Thanks. Glad to be on board. And of course, we're going to continue, I think, today highlighting, discussing the conflict over Ukraine, because, of course, it's something that continues to dominate the headlines. And it's something which everybody worries about. I mean, it's affecting the entire world economy. It's killing thousands of people, resulting in massive death and destruction. And of course, since it's a conflict with nuclear power, it ultimately carries a threat of possible use of nukes and possibly being drawn into World War III. This appears remote, and we remain in at the moment, however, we remain what may be considered, some are calling a hybrid war, a war which is being fought through both military, low level, well, not such a level, but military and economic channels to try to force the sides or one side to agree to terms. To agree to negotiations, basically, because that is the only way this war will end. It's what Zelensky himself has said, even despite all of his, his warlike rhetoric. The speeches by his subordinates saying they will not concede 1 inch of territory to Russia, and this will only end the total expulsion of Russia from Ukraine. And his attack, their criticism of Western, the EU and NATO for not giving sufficient aid to achieve such objectives. Nonetheless, Zelensky said quite clearly on television the other day, following a visit by the Polish Prime Minister, that the only way to resolve this conflict is going to be through negotiations. That is going to happen at some stage, whether it takes months or whether it takes maybe years. We don't know. But of course, a key element of this, let's briefly go over the military element of the military events of the past few days, past week. Mariupol finally fell, right? Mariupol finally fell. I think everybody knew it would happen. It had long been predicted. There's no way those fighters could hold up there in the Azovstan steelworks forever. And the Russians, finally, they gave up to the Russians, surrendered in what Zelensky called an evacuation, but they basically surrendered, gave up the weapons, and are now being held as prisoners of war, we should hope. The question is whether their status will even be respected. But anyway, let's hope the Russians will play straight on this. Now, the surrender of Mariupol, however much it might have been expected, and whatever the amazing thing that it took Russia so long to bring about the surrender of these few hundred top 1,000 or 2,000 fighters that presumably took refuge there. It does also show up some of Ukraine's limitations. Obviously, Ukraine did not have the ability to, the capability to reinforce these men or break through the Russian encirclement of Mariupol and get to them and relieve the siege, which indicates the fact that Ukraine is not in a position to push back or regain much territory that Russians have taken in southern, at least in southern and eastern Ukraine. They did this in the north, or in Kiev and later in Kharkiv, the two northern cities where the Russians seem to be overexposed, where they had the supply lines were overexposed and they could not, they were far more vulnerable to counterattacks as well as the type of guerrilla resistance that the Ukrainians put up. They were on a limb, but in the south and east, the Ukrainians don't appear to be achieving. The Russians are making slight gains, and they're likely to make more in the next few days. They are moving on. They're moving right now, I think, to pretty much take control of a town called Zverodotsk, which would give them complete control of Luhansk. And they will probably move from there on to a siege of Kramatorsk, which is one of the main industrial cities there. And that is probably going to be another prolonged siege, a very prolonged battle, which will last several weeks, at least months, probably. And that would pretty much decide the course of the war, whether the Russians will stay with Donbass or whether the Ukrainians have any possible chance of expelling them or forcing them at least to give back territory in the negotiations. If the Russian army begins to fall apart, if morale gets so low that units begin to mutiny, that kind of thing, but it's still a possibility. It's still a it's still a latent possibility. If the Russians lose in Ukraine, it'll be because the army doesn't want to fight. This is the reason why it's lost, why it's had the losses that it's had so far, and it's the reason why it could still conceivably lose and make a negotiating solution not at all, not what they expect to get out of it. But I mean, there's another front to this war, of course, and that is the economic front. And as I've said before, I think we anticipated quite some time ago that the Western sanctions are not having their desired effect, and in fact are very ineffective. And as far they're not having the overwhelming effect on the Russian economy that at first they were meant to have, everybody expected them to have, and that perhaps they weren't really having. It was, and I think there was a lot of hype about it. The Russians have been able. The ruble is stabilized, and in fact, it's now quoting at 5-year highs against the euro and the dollar, and the yen. And Russia is is still selling a lot of oil to everybody, and the Europeans have had no choice but to cave in and buy and continue to buy Russian oil and gas on Russian terms, pretty much, which is to pay for it in rubles. There are slight things that they may have to do that could, in altering the contracts, could also work to the detriment of Russia in the long term. This is something to touch on later. Basically, I mean, the Russians have very effectively manipulated their currency. They have forcing buyers of Russian oil and gas to pay in rubles. They're in effect forcing the Europeans and the Japanese, mainly. I think the North Americans have ceased any import of Russian oil, which is very small, very small amount to begin with. But yeah, I have the Europeans doing it, the Japanese and the Indians, and I guess the Chinese as well. They're all buying Russian oil now in rubles. And what does this do? Since they didn't have many rubles in their reserves, it means they have to buy rubles in order to buy Russian oil. This creates this artificial demand for rubles, which of course is what has made the currency go up. It's what's made the currency rise. And this is essentially how Russia has maintained the value of its currency. And how long they can keep this up, we don't know. I mean, this also has a lot of very negative effects. It reduces foreign investment by having to prop up interest rates to 20%. The Russians have had to prop up interest rates to 20% to keep up the value of the ruble. In other words, so when they're foreign buy the ruble, buy the oil, they're buying it at a value that the Russian central bank is creating, generating artificially by raising interest, or a great sacrifice to the rest of the economy by raising interest rates 20%. Can you imagine what this is? I mean, in America, we're talking about possible recession because the central bank might have to raise interest rates by 1% this year. So can you imagine what it does to an economy when you raise interest rates by 20%? Okay. Obviously, this will create tremendous scarcity. People can't import. There can be no further investment in the economy. There can be no imports. The imports are going to virtually freeze. This will destroy Russian industry. It'll destroy investment. And eventually, of course, it'll create tremendous scarcity. And while the ruble may be stable or artificially stable if a Russian wants to exchange rubles into dollars, but of course they can only do in very small amounts, they won't be able to buy anything. Because the economy will be like, well, I suppose it'll be like Venezuela. Russia is going to be Venezuela. You know, it's quite amazing, Christian, when you think about it. Venezuela is serving as an example. Everybody thought that what was happening in Venezuela, the collapse of the economy, was some kind of lesson to the rest of the world. But in fact, it's an example which others are following. I mean, it works. You know, the regime stays in place, stays in power, despite the massive economic, with sufficient repression, and in Russia with a war on, despite the massive economic suffering that is causing its people through artificial measures to shore up its national currency. Right?
Right.
And the massive disinvestment this is going to create. And if Venezuela can do it, Russia can do it. I mean, it's got a lot more. There's a lot more commodities in Venezuela. It's got oil, it's got gas, it's got gold, it has, Venezuela also gold, we got in that the other day, but it has nickel, far larger amounts of minerals, strategic minerals, aluminum.
Strategy.
So, yeah, I mean, Russia is in a position to play this out over a long period of time. So the idea that these sanctions are going to bring down the regime at any time soon, is fantasy. You know, eventually, yes, the Europeans are finding alternative sources for oil and gas. I think Germany just signed a big gas deal with Qatar. They will probably get some more from Algeria and maybe more from the United States if the administration gets around to trying to allowing more oil exploration. Yeah, I mean, it's the effect that the economic sanctions are having on Russia, certainly any possible any possibility they may have to bring about regime change is, I think, at this point, pretty much mute. It's not going to happen. Certainly not anytime soon. Certainly not anytime soon.
How low intensity, but the long-term warfare is a problem for the region due to stability. How can NATO counteract this negative effect on the security?
You mean what? Sorry, Chris, could you repeat the question? What long term? What the?
how low intensity but long-term warfare is a problem for the region due to stability. How could NATO counteract this effect?
Yeah, right. The intensity of the warfare, the low intensity. Well, look, basically, well, I mean, there's nothing low intensity about what the Russians were doing. I mean, if you were in Donetsk, I think it'd be very high intensity. It's low intensity in the sense the war is remaining now contained to that region, and is not, is not spilling over into a total regional war, into an international war outside of Ukraine, and of course, what everybody fears is a possible nuclear confrontation. In that sense, it's low intensity. But I mean, it certainly what's going on in Donetsk, in the Donbass region, is certainly very high intensity. The Russians, now they've taken Mariupol, they can concentrate a lot more firepower, and as well as infantry on the Ukrainian positions in Donbass, in central Donbass, talking about a 500-kilometer front, more or less, sort of wedge shape, and they're pounding them ceaselessly with artillery and rocket fire and airstrikes. They're a bit low on the airstrikes, they are affecting the Stingers and the British laser Starstreak laser guided stuff, which is highly effective against any aircraft. But even just artillery and rocket fire on these positions is devastating over a long period of time. So far, the Ukrainians are holding out. Again, we don't know how long. I mean, I think what they intend to do is, repeat Mariupol 10 times. They have to just wear down these garrisons, wear down these pockets of resistance, these Ukrainian-held positions over time with just ongoing attrition, artillery, rocket fire, and strike. And what is very disturbing, what is most disturbing, is information to the effect that some of the people that have been moving into the Ukraine, some of the Russian personnel or Syrians that have been moving into Ukraine from Syria. I told you they've been moving a few thousand personnel from Syria into Ukraine, both Russians and Syrians, and Hezbollah fighters that have joined up with the Russians. They're actually acting as mercenaries in this fight. Include experts in barrel bombs. They've got a whole group, apparently, of experts in these barrel bombs that are now in Russia, ready to deploy, or using their expertise to deploy in the Donbass, in Ukraine. So in other words, I don't know if you heard of the barrel bombs used in Syria. These are pretty low cost, weapons, which are easily made. Basically, you take a barrel or a cast canister, and you fill it up with explosives. Perhaps you might shrapnel, and chlorine as well. It was a good way of also conducting chemical weapons attacks without it being too obvious. It is done from the air, so it exposes air crews to some danger, but I don't think Putin and his generals mind losing air crews. I mean, they send them on suicide missions to drop barrel bombs on a Ukrainian trench, which will, of course, devastate the trench. I mean, if you're talking about, it's a massive explosion, and it causes massive casualties, both military and civilians. And it proved very effective in Syria. It proved very effective in Syria, and it's about 70,000 barrel bombs were dropped in Syria. Okay, and this is the model that Russia seems to be using, or appears about to use, in Ukraine. As I say, it could also be a way of conducting these guys chemical attacks with chlorine included with the explosives, which of course makes a massive, it destroys, it kills people for hundreds of yards around, maybe a kilometer, maybe up to a kilometer. So this is what the Russians now have planned they're working on it. I think that soon they're going to start dropping these barrel bombs laced with chemical weapons. So this is, this is what's coming up. On the other hand, of course, Ukraine is not Syria. The Ukrainians are getting a lot of military support from the West. This $40 billion American package had just been signed by President Biden, which includes about $20 billion just in military support alone. And this certainly, in Syria, the amount we support that went to the anti-regime guerrillas, to the anti-regime movement against President Assad and Russia, and the Iranian-backed forces of Hezbollah that were fighting for Assad in Syria was minimal. The Syrian Free Army, I forget exactly what it was called at this stage, didn't receive anywhere a fraction of what the Ukrainians are getting in terms of American military aid. So that's a factor to consider. There's a limit to how far the Russians can push back the Ukrainians, and I think we all understand the fact that Russia's fantasy of turning all the Ukraine into a puppet state is pretty much now a pipe dream. It's never going to happen. However, if they manage to diminish and eliminate or seriously diminish the Ukrainian positions in the Donbass, again, we're talking about a period of months this is going to last, and just make it impossible for the Ukrainians to hold on there very long. It may come to negotiation if the Russians will take most of eastern and southern Ukraine, Donbass, which is Ukraine's industrial heartland. You have gas fields there. You have a lot of industrial infrastructure there. So it's not. They're not taking over an empty space. They're taking over a very important part of what the Ukrainian economy is.
The news that talk about Putin's health is not good. It is a target for a nuclear attack due to instability of his government. Is true or is not true?
There seems to be less and less talk about it, Christian. I think the Russians have quieted down the rhetoric of using nuclear weapons. This doesn't mean they won't do it. Who knows? Maybe they'll sneak it up on us without even talking too much about it, so as not to alert us too much, not to warn us off too much. But they seem to be toning that down. I think they're quite confident they can take over the Donbass using the kind of tactics they use in Syria and Chechnya. And they've limited their goal pretty much to that. Putin's health, well, again, it's conceivably yes. If he does go into surgery, which everybody says, there are reports about. There are also reports, in fact, in a recent interview on CNN, ex-CIA Director General Petraeus downplayed this. He said that however consistent these reports are, but he didn't see any convincing confirmation of the fact that Putin has any kind of terminal or serious illness that requires a lot of surgery. That he doesn't know if these reports are all that credible, all that reliable. So, however, it may not, who knows, it may not be true. But if he does go into surgery, I think he does have some health problems. Of course, it's only the strain of the Ukraine, certainly, his failed, until now, largely failed Ukrainian operation. Very stressful, has had some sort of effect on practically a 70-year-old man. The one taking over from him is Poroshenko, the hardliner. And who knows, maybe he may resort to use weapons, maybe in a limited scale in Ukraine. But again, I think the Russians have pretty much decided they can do this without it, using the tactics that they use in Syria, which I just described, and that the Ukrainians will have to negotiate a deal. And I think even everybody's saying this at this stage. So how long it takes to get to the position where that becomes imperative, where that is forced, where Zelensky has to prevail upon his hardliners who want to go on, who seem to think they can push Russia out of Ukraine eventually through sheer force. We have yet to see. We have yet to see. But the nuclear threat, at least for the moment, seems to have diminished somewhat. With the Finland entering NATO, or saying they're going to enter NATO, or Russia's response has only been to cut off gas to Finland. And I think they're in no position to even reinforce put troops on the border of Finland because they're all occupied. Everything's gone. It's running into Ukraine. So, so far they pretty much had to accept the fact that Finland and Sweden are joining NATO without saber rattling too much. They haven't really done much about it, except of course to cut off oil and gas exports to gas supply to
Finland and Sweden can help the economy of the region and Ukraine to stabilize in this moment.
Sorry, Christian. Sweden and Finland can what? Sorry.
Can help the economy. Can help the economy of the region for the stability to NATO. Is the new members for the NATO, Finland and Sweden can help the economy. Well,
sure. I mean, they certainly bolster the NATO's position in Eastern Europe. I mean, they're two very strong economies. They're both very wealthy countries.
Right.
They can certainly bolster the economic position of NATO. Sweden is a very powerful and a very strong military, in spite of the fact it's a neutral country. Has a very large navy, very large submarine force. So they certainly would contribute a lot to NATO. It's not like having Montenegro join or having Slovakia join or Moldova join. Moldova, which now again, I mean, that's something that the British now say we're going to have to go in and defend because they feel Moldova could be a danger of succumbing, possibly, if not a Russian invasion, perhaps a pro-Russian coup within Moldova. But no, I mean, they're very strong countries, and they will certainly contribute a lot to NATO and to ultimately shoring up Ukraine indirectly.
And Russia is not comfortable with these new members in NATO. No, Russia's attack maybe in that.
No, they're not happy about it at all. But again, as I said before, in spite of the fact they had saber rattled about, imagine Ukraine joining NATO, and warned about, any further anyone who joins NATO there would be consequences, and Russia would retaliate, and any further enlargement of NATO could a nuclear response, and all the rhetoric they used, all the frightening rhetoric they used. Ultimately, they've had to. There's nothing they can do about Sweden and Finland joining NATO. Their response has not been. It's not discernible. There's been no response to speak of, except cutting off gas to Finland. They're cut off the gas supply to Finland. What the Finns are going to do about that, I don't know. I think they're going to get it from Latvia or something, or Estonia. But again, that's their weapon. That's their weapon. Oil and gas. There's no way that Europe can wean itself away from Russia's oil and gas at any time soon. And that's what they're using. I mean, that's what's going to continue to finance their war.
Oil and gas, content defense.
For the foreseeable future. And that's what's keeping the currency from completely collapsing.
That's true. Very true. Very interesting. Okay, for conclusion in this podcast,
yeah, I mean, for my conclusion, the caveat to this, again, we're talking long term, but there's a rejoinder to this, which is, okay, buyers of Russian oil and gas have now, they've got to renegotiate their contracts with Russia, because the contract stipulated that they would buy Russian gas and oil with dollars, euros, and yen, right?
Right.
That's what the contract stipulated. So they're gonna. So, but if by renegotiating the contract to agree to buy them in rubles, it also allows these countries to lower the amount of gas they are going to buy from Russia. So the revenues may start to come down. At least the revenues they're getting from Europe and Japan, as they find alternative sources. Move to the Middle East, Africa, the United States, Canada, elsewhere. It's a gradual process. I mean, it cannot happen from overnight, like some people were saying a few weeks ago. It was amazing. Europe was going to suddenly cut off oil and gas. In Germany, this would cause the GDP growth to go down by half. Right?
Germany, yeah.
Germany. It would cost 500,000 jobs. I mean, consistently. There's no way they can do this. It was, I think, State Department generated hype. I mean, there's no way Europe could do this. And so I really think that this, but they gradually will move away from Russian oil and renegotiating the contracts with Russia to pay in rubles, they will also reduce the amount of oil and gas they buy from Russia. However, again, China is going to increase purchase of Russian oil and gas. We'll have China out of this. The Chinese trade with Russia has gone up by about 28%.
Wow.
In the past quarter. In the past quarter, it's gone up 28%.
That's the deal.
And the U.S. is afraid that Russia is also on top of buying a lot of Russian commodities. That's all they buy from Russia. That's all they get. They're even giving them some economic and military aid as well. Maybe drones, that kind of thing. So low-key stuff. Well, not low-key in the battlefield, but stuff they can move around without much of a problem. Needless to say, when eventually, you see, the Chinese can only have a winning game with this, because as Russia is forced to sell them more and more commodities at a lower price, because the price of at a lower price, which China is getting right now, they will eventually take over the Russian economy, because as the investment collapses, as imports, as the only country that can import from becomes China, because China will be the only country that's will be selling them consumer goods as well as components with some electronic components and that kind of thing. China will end up taking over Russia's economy. It will be like a developed country taking over a third world country, basically, in return for industrial investment, industrial input. They come to own all the commodities of that country. They come to control them to a very large extent. So that's essentially what Russia's going to become, or China's going to become, a kind of massive vassal state, right? That's what's going to happen.
Very interesting analysis about the deals in the new contracts for the new negotiation with this Russia and export the gas. No? It's very interesting analysis with Martin Arostegui. Thank you so much. Subscribe all for sharing everything about the international law channel, international law and security with Martin Arostegui, the most important journalist. Thank you, Martin. See you next.
Thank you, Christian. See you next week. Bye-bye.
Next weekend, next Sunday. Bye.